That is why a country like the United States could get the Palestinians and the Israelis around a table, even though its own sympathies are clearly with Israel, and even though that didn't work out. But the point is that it had the means to offer incentives. Africa simply doesn't have that.
A weekend perhaps to forget in South African international relations, maybe further exposing the incapacity of the Ramaphosa administration, various logistical issues, communications issues, which ultimately meant that a second airplane did not accompany President Ramaphosa on his trip onward from Poland to Ukraine and then on to Russia, but instead had to return home. Joining me to unpack perhaps a seminal weekend in what could be told by the Ramaphosa administration ultimately in history is Terence Corrigan, the project manager at the Institute of Race Relations. Terence, thanks very much for your time on this Monday morning as we record. Just to start off with perhaps your thoughts on what this whole episode this past weekend can tell us about the capabilities or lack thereof of the current government, the sort of idea of a capable state, but then not being able to meet that out in reality, not being able to, you talk a big game, but then you can't sort of deliver it on the one hand.
Well, I think that there's a couple of things. We're unpacking this issue, and they couldn't unpack their plane. I think there's a certain symmetry to that. Look, I think that the most obvious issue is that this was obviously chaotically planned. There've been News 24, I think, has been very good about its coverage, and there's indications that warning lights were flashing loud and clear from the get go, and they were ignored. I think in a purely technical sense, it seems that no flight clearance over Italian airspace was gained. These are elementary things that I think any airline would take care of. Transferring weapons into another state is a very, very sensitive issue, but it's also something that South Africa, with its diplomatic footprints, one of the largest in the world, one would think should be familiar with, but evidently not. Now those are purely the technical, administrative aspects. There's also the political side. There's been a lot of gnashing of teeth about the way the South African delegation was treated, and I think it must be pointed out it's not the political side, not the president and his entourage, but the support personnel. I'm not sure to what extent this is accurate, but I think that it's important to bear in mind that South Africa isn't the only country that gets to have a painful history and strong geopolitical sentiments. For Poland, it has a very, very long and painful history with Russia. The invasion of Ukraine hit something very, very deep, both in their current geopolitical orientation and also in their national psyche. You can go back to the Napoleonic Wars if you want to see the pedigree of this. The sense that South Africa may, has not only been sympathetic to Russia, which I think is pretty much undeniable now, but may have actually contributed to its military arsenal. Question that's still up in the air, would assure it of not getting the warmest reception. And perhaps this is what what the Polish authorities seized on. Now, once again, this is not necessarily speculative, but I think it's reasonable speculation. Now, we have General Rudy, not a career policeman or a state security person, saying this is all racism, and they insisted on speaking Polish. Well, maybe that was meant as a slight, but the question I would ask is, well, where are the South African diplomats who could respond in Polish? South Africa, as I emphasize, is one of the largest diplomatic footprints in the world. But I get the sense in my own, and this will certainly be my own experience, that South Africa's diplomats are just not given that kind of human development support, or that the requirements, career management that some other countries insist on. If you're going to maintain an embassy in a country, it seems to me that you would need at least some of your own citizens who are representing the interests of the South African state to be able to engage with that culture on its own terms, which would mean, Polish language skills. I mean, South Africa and the ruling party talk a big game about the eternal friendship with China. I'd be very interested to know how many South African diplomats are fluent in Chinese. Um, and to say, well, we're a developing country, or the resource constraints, that doesn't cut the mustard. You can't maintain this level of diplomatic representation and not get some sort of return on investment for it. The National Development Plan raised questions about this. And while all countries use ambassadorships and foreign postings as a means of reward, in South Africa, I think it's internationally recognized as being rather extreme. I saw a figure which may be somewhat dated, but I don't think it's invalid. That 80% of our ambassadors are political appointees. I think in most countries that hovers around 30%, with the rest being career diplomats who actually understand, the need to represent the interests of the state and to assist people, citizens of the country. I wonder whether that is the case that exists for South Africa's diplomatic missions abroad. Certainly, looking at this, I don't get that sense.
Terence, just a question on the sort of whole idea of a peace mission, and to focus. We can go in on the minutiae, I think, ad nauseum on the logistical issues in the South African regard, but the peace mission idea itself, African leaders going to Ukraine and Russia to try and broker peace or maybe get the ball rolling in some way. Just your thoughts on that as a goal. I mean, issues around, do they have a legitimate interest and claim in this particularly? I mean, my point of view, very concerned about the food security and food price issue. So wanting to signal that mostly to their own constituents in their countries. But even if you agree with me on that sort of interpretation, does that mean that they should have this platform to negotiate, to mediate between Putin and Zelensky?
My take on this is that it is a legitimate exercise. I do think that well, first of all, there was a kind of more moral or normative issue that we have as human beings, a common humanity, and obviously you don't want to see conflict anywhere in the world. But I think that this particular conflict, because of the disruption of food supply chains, hits a country like it's Africa, which depends on those food imports particularly hard. Maize, wheat. So yes, they have a definite interest in seeing it resolved. And I think a more immediate interest, even if the conflict continues, in seeing the flows of grain and particular other products such as fertilizers and the relevant components continued. In that sense, yes, it is legitimate. My concern about this is that it's not apparent to me exactly what this mission is seeking to achieve. And I think a lot of the commentary about it has been very loose in its description. Is this a mediation effort? Is this a fact-finding mission? Is this, well, what exactly are you trying to achieve? And while I think it's legitimate, I also think that it is, I think, what one could delicately call a long shot. There are, if the idea is to try and engage in some sort of shuttle diplomacy to establish points of interest, along the lines of the rapprochement between Israel and Egypt in the 1970s, possibly that there would be a role for African countries. But it's not apparent. It's not apparent to me that this is what they are doing, or whether there is an appetite for it. I think you're quite correct that that they are doing this in response to domestic stimuli. Although whether for, foreign politics is sufficiently linked in the minds of their own constituents with their day-to-day living circumstances. That, I think, is an open question. I really don't have an answer to that. I know South African politics very, very seldom actually um, uh, uh, turns on our foreign policy. I think that you also have a difficulty here. Is there an appetite for resolution? And this is actually something that I found quite disappointing about the president's comments in Kiev. I think that he butchered South Africa's history. The history of his own party was that negotiations would be a form of struggle. The idea that we'd sort of lay down, resolve our conflict, and then get uh, a political solution. No, that was nonsense. Thabo Mbeki himself at one point said, "We are not struggling for negotiations. We are struggling for the quote complete transfer of power to the people." That is as uncompromising as either Putin or Zelensky could be, and that was the ANC's position right into 1994. So I think that his remarks there were deeply disingenuous, if I can use that the dreadful cliche. Um, I think also there's the question of is there anything useful that Africans can put forward? Yeah, I really don't think so, unless there is an appetite for mediation, which I don't see either Russia or Ukraine calling on. Africa cannot cajole, it can't bribe, it can't offer security guarantees, it can't offer economic assistance. It would be less important, I think, whether Ramaphosa is pro-Russia or Zambia is pro-Ukraine or whatever, than whether they could actually influence. That is why a country like the United States could get the Palestinians and the Israelis around a table, even though its own sympathies are clearly with Israel, and even though that didn't work out. But the point is that it had the means to offer incentives. Africa simply doesn't have that.
Thank you very much for watching. Let us know in the comments below your thoughts on the last few days in South African international relations and South African foreign policy, what you thought of President Ramaphosa's mission to Ukraine and to Russia. Until next time, this has been Chris Hattingh for the Center for Risk Analysis. Take care.